Hi, in today's video I want to talk in more detail about the quantum movement system. In most of my videos I've been focusing on the walking code and to a lesser extent the Tai Chi Code. Each of those codes are really subsets of the entire movement system, which I call the quantum movement system, which I developed about 10 years ago. I call it the quantum movement system because in physics, a quantum is the minimum amount of any physical property involved in an interaction. And when we talk about movement, what we're talking about is the individual components that go into the interaction that causes what we see as whole body movement. And what I'm focusing on in the quantum movement system is the movements of the core. And we have three elements to the core, and each of those are the quanta in a sense. And each of those quanta go into or interact with each other to produce a physical movement that we just see as a flowing of the body, but really is generated by a specific movement of the upper torso rotation, a specific movement of our lower torso rotation, and a specific movement of our pelvis. In other words, all three elements of our spine are involved, and they must be involved in a very specific way. A very specific quantity of each one of these inputs go into all of our movements. I'm first going to describe the movement system in and of itself, and then I'm going to go into the history of how and why I developed this, and then go into what it can be applied to. To begin, I'm going to talk about the actual system and what it means and where it was derived from. It is really derived from an analysis of Tai Chi theory, which is more than 1,000 years old, but I have developed it into a more specific and detailed assessment of the core movements, which are not really defined in Tai Chi, but in the quantum movement system, I define each of these individual quanta and how they interact with each other in a very specific manner to create whole body movement. So what I'm talking about is three elements of the spine: the chest, which is rotated by our upper abdominal muscles. If you reach across with your left arm to the right, you can feel the upper abdominal muscles on your left turning the body. Reach across your body from left to right and feel how you're directing the rotation of the left side of your chest, and consequently the left arm, with the upper abdominal muscles on the left. You can feel that, and then when you come back to a neutral position, what you should feel is you're not pulling back with your shoulder blade. What you're doing to return to a neutral position is turning the other side, the right side, forward and releasing that forward rotation on the left side. This fits with the Tai Chi theory that all movement is created by rotation of the waist. And one aspect of the waist is the upper abdominal muscle rotation, which in effect rotates our thoracic spine from our top of the chest to the bottom of the chest. That level of the spine is directed by rotation of our upper abdominal muscles. The upper abdominal muscles on the right turn the body to the left, or the thoracic spine to the left. The upper abdominal muscles on the left turn the thoracic spine to the right. And you can very easily feel that. Some of the other principles in Tai Chi give us an indication that in functional movement, the movement of rotation that we use is going to be primarily in this forward direction, kind of like a mime walking against the wind. Even if I'm traveling backwards, it's not because I'm pulling backwards, it's because I'm going forwards in the other side. And what we need to see is this not pulling back like that, which is not functional movement and would actually throw us off balance, because our balance is really defined by our ability to stay upright, and our feet are in front of the body, not behind the body. So if we were actually using a lot of backward movement, we would be very susceptible to throwing ourselves off balance. So in balanced functional movement, we stay upright by turning forwards, always keeping the energy in front of the body. This way I can keep my center of gravity over the front of my feet and not falling back behind the heels. The second part or element or quanta in the quantum movement system is going to be our waist rotation, the lower part of the waist. This is governed by the rotation of our lower abdominal muscles, or our internal obliques primarily. And what they're going to do is rotate our lower abdomen and consequently our pelvis at the same time, because they're hooked up with one another. And the lower abdominal muscles on my left side are going to pull my lower abdomen and my pelvis to the left in a backwards direction. So they're actually turning backwards. My left side turns my lumbar spine and pelvis counterclockwise. And the right lower abdominal muscles turn the pelvis and the lumbar spine clockwise. So they pull backwards. That is the backwards energy that comes with rotation. And as I turn back on one side, and you try this and practice, just turn your belly button and your pelvis to your left, and you're going to feel your weight go back into your left heel. Now turn your belly button and your pelvis to the right, and you're going to feel your weight go back into your right heel. A lot of times you'll hear a concept about grounding or rooting, and the weight and the rotation of the lower abdominal muscles is really responsible for this, because what it's doing is rooting or grounding that heel on the side to which the lower abdominal muscles are rotating. Part of the meaning of rotation in Tai Chi, rotation of the waist, is that we're not turning both sides at the same time. We have separate muscles on either side of my upper abdomen and separate muscles on either side of my lower abdomen. They work independently, but when we move functionally, we use one side at a time. Either I take the right side and turn it to the left, or I take the left side and turn it to the right. What happens if I take the right and left side and turn them together? You'll get a forward pitching action, because part of rotation of the upper abdominal muscles is a flexion component of the spine. If you were lying down doing a crunchy sit-up, you would feel that forward flexion component as we exercise those upper abdominal muscles. When we're standing up, however, we counterbalance that forward flexion part of the upper torso with all of the other actions, the hip actions and the lower abdominal actions, which occur at the same time and have to occur at the same time for us to stay upright. And that really is the genesis of the quantum movement system. It is looking at the individual components of chest rotation, waist rotation, and hip action that are required to keep us vertical. And humans are the only animals out there that have vertical posture. And humans are the only animals out there that have vertical posture, and we have evolved that neurologic ability to maintain our balance over millions of years, and that is a very complex system, and it is governed by our neurological system from our brain telling us where we want to go, but into our spinal cord and involving our spinal reflexes that coordinate our upper body, our lower body, and then our legs, so we can always keep balance. If you think about it in this way, it is very difficult for you to actually think about the individual inputs into standing upright. Imagine if you were to take your feet and point them down or plantar flex both of your feet without counterbalancing the rest of your body at the same time. So if you have your feet here and your body here, if you were to plantar flex your feet without counterbalancing, your body would fall over, and even a 5 or 10 degree plantar flexion would land you in a complete pratfall on your back. Functionally or neurologically, we don't allow ourselves to do that, or our brain and our spinal reflexes don't allow us to do that. If I were to point my toes down, my reflexes would prevent me from falling over backwards. I would possibly rise up on my toes like this, but that's involving a lot of other muscles aside from just pointing my feet down. If I point my feet down without interaction of any of the other muscles, I would just fall straight over backwards. So the quantum movement system is defining what actions occur at the same time by definition in order to keep us upright. And we learn how to stay upright just by practice as we're babies going up to being toddlers. We learn how to walk and we learn how to stay upright. Then we learn how to do more complex movements, and it just becomes an innate part of our lives, and we don't give it a second thought. But there is something going on between our mind and our spine and our reflexes that is keeping us upright at all times without even having to think about it. That requires a system being at play at all times, even though we're not aware consciously of what that system is. As we try to learn more complex movements, or we try to fix other movements that may be performed not optimally, for instance, walking. We may walk with poor technique, or we may not know how to dance well, and we're trying to fix those. Having a knowledge or a conscious knowledge of the system can help us to fix some of the problems that are going on, or help us to just move more in a conscious manner. And that is what the point or purpose of the quantum movement system is. Now let me get into how I created it and why I created it. And I don't want to say created, it's more like discover, because it's something that's always been there. We all do it, but we don't do it consciously. And I wanted to develop a conscious way of understanding what the body is doing. And it comes from my experience initially as a tango instructor. I've been teaching tango since 1995, and maybe about 15 years ago, I came across a situation that was frustrating for me when trying to teach, that made me think I needed to figure out a more defined way of instructing. And I'd been instructing tango around the country and heavily in San Diego for about 10 years at that point. And I came across a situation in a very basic starter beginner class where one of the students was trying to step to the side. I'm going to back up here a little bit. I was having students just take a side step. And I'm using the term just because that's how I thought about it at the time. Taking a side step from weight on 2 feet and then stepping here, so my spine is now split between the 2 feet. It seemed like a very simple thing to me. But one of the students in the class was doing this every time he would land on his left leg. And I would repeat the instruction, no, just do this, step to the side. And he would go, and I would say again, no, just do this. And he would go. And I didn't have the words to express how he should go about trying to correct what he was doing incorrectly. What we do as Tango instructors at the time, or probably any dance instructor or any Tai Chi instructor, and I had the same experience as a Tai Chi student, we demonstrate a movement and then we expect people to be able to copy that movement. And if they don't do it, we demonstrate it again. And we try to have them repeat the motion as many times as possible in order to capture what we are doing. But sometimes you come across a situation where somebody can't repeat the movement, no matter how simple it appears. What I realized at the time was I could not really explain to him what the difference of falling to the side like that and stepping to the side like that was. I could do it. It was very easy. Most of the people in the class could do it, but he could not, and I was unable to explain why he could not. That was a really frustrating experience for me, and I began at that time to try to figure out a system for how we can explain exactly what simple movements or complex movements in a way that anybody can understand what it is. As a Tango student also, because everybody at any high level of mastery of something is always both a teacher and a student, and my Tango coach would be going over very complex movements with me and with my wife, who is my dance partner. And there were certain movements that were very complex that were challenging, and I could get through the motions in the way it appeared he was doing it. And I had a hard time leading my wife. When I tried to lead her, she wasn't following it. But then when he would lead her, he was able to lead her perfectly fine. When I tried to lead him, he could follow the movement. When I tried to lead her, she couldn't follow the movement. But when he led her, she was able to follow the movement. Even though it looked externally like I was doing the exact same thing, there was something internally that wasn't working. And I would always say, can you just explain what exactly you're doing with your body to make this thing happen correctly? And just like I was doing with my students and my Tai Chi instructors did with me, he would try to repeat the motion multiple times, maybe give a couple metaphors about the feeling, but there was no way to explain the movement in a way that I could capture it if I couldn't capture it just by watching him and then repeating it over and over again. There was something missing in the ability to explain the full body movement that I found lacking. This came to a head when I started taking Tai Chi lessons, and this is probably around 2010, so 10 years ago or so. I began taking Tai Chi lessons, and I found in Tai Chi a very kindred feeling of movement with the Tango. I would do a lot of Tai Chi movements, and they really felt internally like the same thing I was doing in Tango, only in Tango we don't move the arms because we're holding our partner in a frame, versus in Tai Chi we're doing a lot of motion with the arms. But I could feel that the movements in the body were essentially the same. And that really started getting me to believe that all of these types of complex movements really are all the same. They are all related. At the time when I began studying Tai Chi, I was already a couple years into working on my analysis of trying to figure out how to explain at the core level what was going on in Tango. And I had already come up with the three elements of the core, meaning the chest rotation, the waist rotation, and the hip action as the three components that must be correlated in a proper fashion in order to do any movement. And I was struggling to try to piece that all together in a coherent framework. And then as I was studying Tai Chi, I was reading a lot of Tai Chi books, and I began studying about the Tai Chi trigrams, or the 8 essential energies or fundamental energies of Tai Chi. And there's 8 of them. And most Tai Chi practitioners are at least familiar with the names of them and a couple of movements in Tai Chi that utilize those particular energies. But of the thousands and thousands of Tai Chi movements out there, only a handful of them actually utilize the names of those energies that are commonly described in Tai Chi. And so I was reading all of this information about the Tai Chi trigrams, and I was like, wow, somebody's already figured this out. There are 8 energies, and that is coming from the core somehow, and all of the movements in Tai Chi, it is said by the Tai Chi fundamental principles, are governed by these 8 specific energies. And so I was like, wow, what I've been trying to figure out in Tango, because Tango is related to Tai Chi clearly because I can feel it, if I just go and ask my Tai Chi instructor what these 8 energies are, I will be able to figure this out and apply it to the Tango. Unfortunately, what happened is I went to my instructor and asked him about the 8 trigrams and the 8 fundamental energies, and what I was told was this is really just a metaphorical type of description of energy in a vague sense, and there wasn't any real specific definition for these sort of energies. And that didn't quite settle in my brain, because the instructor I had at this school in San Diego was really excellent, and he just could perform Tai Chi perfectly, and he was so detail oriented in our lessons, where if I'm doing a motion and my hand was in the wrong position, he would like rework everything to get my hand exactly in the right spot. And I'm thinking, well, if by definition in Tai Chi all of this movement is coming from the core and the hands are just responding, then clearly there's a very precise outcome he's looking for. And why is he fixing my hands? Because if my hands are in the wrong position, by definition, it must be something that I'm doing wrong here. And he would continue to fix my hands, and I would ask him, what do I need to do here to make my hands go into the right spot? And that he couldn't explain. He could do what I did in Tango, which is repeat the movements over and over again and hope that I could come to the same physical conclusion when I tried to imitate what he did, but he couldn't explain what was going on in the core. And I read more books and watched more videos, and what I learned was nobody had a definition of the 8 trigrams or the 8 fundamental energies in Tai Chi. And they had never, in the thousands of years of Tai Chi, been defined. Now, I didn't really believe that, because the Tai Chi movements are so precise, and the trigrams are very precisely written, and you can see some of my other videos on the Tai Chi trigrams. And I was thinking in my mind, these are awfully specific to be metaphorical. The energies that they describe in the trigrams in symbolic form are very clear, with yin and yang in different variations, 8 specific variations. I was in my mind thinking, this is very clear to the person or people who developed this, but for some reason they didn't write down what they were trying to convey. Or maybe they did in their close circle, because for thousands of years in Tai Chi, it was a family-run practice. People learned within families. It wasn't widely spread out until the more modern era in China, when they spread Tai Chi to the nation in a more simplified fashion, because it was really good for business throughout the world. That is when Tai Chi began to spread around. But prior to that, and certainly back thousands of years ago when the trigrams or the 8 energies were developed, it was very closely held information, and so somebody wouldn't be writing this down and spreading it around. They would keep it within their family. So I believe somebody knew what they were talking about when they created these 8 energies, because they are so specific, but they did not write it down in a fashion where people in modern times really know what they were talking about. So at the time in Tai Chi, I was still relatively new and relatively naive, and I felt that even though my instructor said there was no definition, I thought maybe he just didn't know it and there were other people that knew it. So I was going to go home and combine what I was reading about in the trigrams and yin and yang and see if I could just figure out what was going on my own. And then I could use that information to try to improve my Tai Chi study. And so I looked at the yin and yang definitions of the trigrams, and I'm not going to go into that in any significant detail here. I do in some of my other videos on the 8 techniques of Tai Chi. Go ahead and watch those videos. I'm not going to go into detail on that here, but what I did is take those definitions, and I saw each of the movements in Tai Chi, each of the 8 energies, has a trigram is 3 lines. Each of the lines represent either yin or yang energy. And I thought to myself, okay, there's 3 lines of the trigram. I've already been working on 3 elements of the core in Tango: the rotation of the chest, the rotation of the waist, and the action of the hip joints. Clearly, there must be some sort of correlation between the 3 elements of yin and yang in Tai Chi and the chest rotation, the waist rotation, and my hip action. So how can I put them together? And so I just simply did this. I said, well, what yin is a kind of retreating energy, passive energy, a non-aggressive energy, more of a defensive energy, and yang is a more aggressive or confrontational energy, a more outward expression of energy. I tried to define for myself what would be the definition of yin or yang as it pertains to rotation of the chest and rotation of the waist, and then the action of the hip joints. For the chest and the waist, originally, that didn't seem to be very obvious, but it seemed fairly clear from the action of the hip joints what would be yin and what would be yang. I'm going to back up here. So I have 2 primary actions in my hip joints. I can flex my hip sideways, I can flex my hip, or I can extend my hip. And if I have my leg on the ground, extending my hip pushes my body forward. I'm pushing off the ground into, let's say, for a Tai Chi or martial arts perspective, I have an opponent here and I want to attack them. I'm going to use my hip to push off the ground towards them. That would appear to be a yang hip action. And then a yin hip action, let's say I'm trying to move away in a defensive manner. I am lifting or flexing my hip, trying to retreat away from my opponent. That would seem to be a yin hip action. So I have yin hip action being hip flexion and yang hip action being hip extension. Now, let's take that and see if we can apply the same rationale to the chest rotation and to the waist rotation. So relative to the hip movement, what would make my arm, if I'm attaching my arm to my chest, so there is some element of the chest rotation that's going to affect my arm, what would make this arm, let's take my left arm, what would make this attack my opponent in a yang manner versus retreat from my opponent. That would be retreating. That would be attacking. And what I can see is that if I turn my upper torso towards my right hip as I extend my right hip, it actually projects my arm outward. You can do this or see this if you do the kickboxing jab. What I'm doing is turning my upper torso or my chest to the right as I extend my right hip, and it automatically projects my left hand outward. If I were to take my upper torso or my chest and turn it towards my right hip as I flex my right hip, now you can see what happens. I'm flexing my right hip and I'm turning my upper torso to the right. Do you see any projection of the arm? No, you see more of a defensive action blocking the arm. So I determined that turning the upper torso towards the flexing hip would be yin, and turning the upper torso towards an extending hip would be yang. So then it became logical to assume that the same thing would apply for the lower torso. And let's look at how that would work. With my lower torso, which is turning the belly button and tucking the pelvis, so that's what my lower abs are going to do. My lower abs can turn my waist back towards my right leg. But if I turn my waist towards my right leg, and now I'm actually flexing my right hip, so you can see I'm turning into this flexing hip and I'm moving away from my opponent. So I have yin as I turn my lower torso towards a flexing hip. But what if I turn my lower torso towards an extending hip? Now my lower abdominal rotation, which is turning the pelvis to the right, is interacting with an extension of my right hip, which is now going to push the body away. And it actually pushes the body away in a manner that's more aggressive than if you were turning towards a flexing hip, or turning away from an extending hip. Because look at it this way. Imagine a baseball being thrown at you and you're going to hit it. You're going to be able to hit the ball farther if they throw the ball towards you and you hit it with the bat. There's a lot of energy interacting there as you have energy moving this way against energy moving this way, and you have an explosion that causes that ball to go out. Now, contrast that with taking a ball and tossing it away from you and then trying to reach with the bat to hit it. You're not going to have nearly as much energy. So when we rotate our lower torso, we get a lot of energy by turning the lower torso towards my extending hip. And if I turn my lower torso away from the extending hip, you get less. I'm extending the right hip, but I'm turning my lower torso here. You get more of a rotational motion. If I go back to the kickboxing analogy, if I'm trying to slip away from somebody, I'm going to extend my right hip. I'm going to turn my lower torso and my upper torso towards the left, away from this extending hip. And what I do is I get a ducking action, which is a retreating action, defensive action, yin. So rotating the lower torso towards the extending hip is yang, and rotating the lower torso away from the extending hip is yin. It also works in the opposite manner. If I rotate my lower torso towards a flexing hip, that is yin. And if I rotate my lower torso away from a flexing hip, that is yang. When I determined these elements of yin and yang, I then tried to see if this put together could formulate a logical explanation for the 8 trigrams. And what I did was say simply, okay, we have two different elements of chest rotation. You can turn to the right or you can turn to the left. We have two different elements of waist rotation. I can turn to the left or turn to the right. With the hips, I have four different actions. I can extend my right hip, or I can flex my right hip, or I can extend my left hip, or I can flex my left hip. So if you put all those together, meaning you have to have one quanta of input from each one of these things, you have two possible actions times two possible actions times four possible actions gives you 16 possible actions, and half of those are mirror images, meaning you have 8 possible combinations of unique core movement. Coincidentally, we have 8 fundamental energies of Tai Chi. Once I figured that out, the real challenge was then, okay, now does this actually apply to all known movements in Tai Chi that are named based on the trigrams? And as I worked through all of the movements that we at least know to be associated with one of the 8 energies, it worked out perfectly. Every one of the movements that is explained by one of the 8 energies in Tai Chi fit with my definition. I will just go through them very quickly here. We have ward off in Tai Chi, which is 3 yang energies, which is extension of the hip, lower torso rotating towards the hip, and upper torso rotating towards the hip. And what we get is the action of ward off. We get the energy of ward off, which we see in Grasp the Sparrow's Tail here, when we extend and the arm bows out away from the body in a way that is very difficult to break. Meaning I have all this energy in the arm coming from the core, and people are not able to push against it with any amount of energy and cause my arm to collapse. That is because not the energy in the arm itself, but because my hip is extending, my lower torso is pushing off that, my upper torso is pushing off that, and it reflects out in the expansion of my left arm. So we have a solid definition there of ward off, which fits with the 8 energies as I described them. Now let's look at a different movement called push. In push, what we have is extension of a hip. We have the upper torso turning away from that hip and the lower torso turning towards that hip. And we also see push in Grasp the Sparrow's Tail in this action here. I push down and then I push forward. As I push forward, I'm extending my right hip. I am turning the right side of my chest away from that right hip, like I'm reaching forward with my right arm, and I'm turning my waist towards that right hip, and it's projecting my arm out in a straight fashion. That is push, and it was totally consistent with the 8 energies of Tai Chi that I had described. Then we have another movement in Tai Chi called pluck. In pluck, the energy, as I defined it, would be turning the upper torso towards the extending hip and the lower torso away from the extending hip. That is the same energy you would see in a jab in kickboxing. Right hip extending, upper torso turning to the right, lower torso turning to the left, extending out my left hand. In Tai Chi, one of the few techniques that we know is associated with pluck is single whip. In single whip, we have a couple elements in the motion that use pluck. One of them is the striking out of my hand in what we call a crane's beak. So the hand is folded over, forming a crane's beak, and I strike out with it, and this is really the reverse energy from the pluck. And this is really the reverse energy that we saw in the jab, because I am moving off of my left hip, which is going to extend. I'm going to turn my upper torso towards that left hip and my lower torso away from it. And that is going to strike out with the right crane's beak. That is pluck. And then the final component of single whip, we step out, we shift forward, and then we turn the palm out. Let me do this closer to the camera. There's a shift forward, and then we turn the palm out. And you can't find in any Tai Chi videos other than mine an explanation for what that is and why that would be effective. Why would you shift forward and then turn your palm out at the very end? Doesn't seem like that would be a very effective martial arts movement, but it is the definition of the movement in single whip. And so I think Tai Chi movements are, in a way, trying to define what happens on our body more so than create an exact martial arts technique. And if you think about pluck, when you do it, what we were doing is shifting forwards by flexing my right hip, meaning I'm pulling my right hip forward as I shift. So there's no outward aggressive action in my left hand. I'm shifting forward. I'm going to go back and forth. I'm just going to shift my weight. Tai Chi is all about learning how to shift weight. As I shift the weight, what I'm doing is flexing or lifting my right hip forward. I'm turning my lower torso or my waist to the left, and I'm turning my upper torso to the right. And so I still have rightward energy in the arm because the chest is turning to the right, lower torso is turning to the left. When I reach the end of this motion, what I'm going to do is extend my right hip, and that automatically causes my hand to turn out in a more attacking manner. I'm flexing the right hip, now I extend the right hip. Once I hit extension, now we have extension of the hip, upper torso turning towards the extending hip, lower torso turning away from the extending hip. We have pluck. I'm not going to go through any more of the Tai Chi techniques. I have a whole video on that. I mentioned earlier the 8 techniques, describing the 8 techniques of Tai Chi. But let me just say that when I went through every movement that has a defined action or energy in Tai Chi, they all fit with the description of the trigrams. And how it's set up is the top line on the trigram is the hip energy, the middle line of the trigram is the chest rotation, and the lower line of the trigram is the waist rotation. And I found no discrepancies in this. And what I found throughout my Tai Chi practice is that every single movement that is done in Tai Chi, not just the final action, but all of the transitions that occur throughout a movement can be defined by one of the trigrams or the 3 elements of the core coordinating with each other. There is no element or no technique that I have found that can't be described in terms of one of the 8 Tai Chi energies. And that would fit with ancient Tai Chi theory that says all movements are created by these 8 energies. I then applied one by one these 8 energies in the Argentine tango, which is an incredibly complex dance with thousands of different possibilities, not just of one person moving, but of leading another person. And what I found was there was no technique in Argentine tango that could not be explained by the 3 elements of the core put together in the same manner as they are in Tai Chi. In tango, and this is the one differentiating factor from Tai Chi theory, is that we actually do have some twisting actions in Tango that are not used in Tai Chi because of the function of Tai Chi. So when I say twisting action, I mean this. When I talk about rotation, I already mentioned earlier that's always forward rotation. Forward on the right or forward on the left. If I'm going backwards on the right, it's only because I'm going forward on the left and releasing the forward rotation from the right. When we dance, however, there are times where we actually will twist, meaning I'm going to turn forward with my abdominal muscles on the left and turn backwards by pulling my upper back muscles or my scapula backwards on the right. So instead of just getting a forward rotation like this, I get a twisting action. And we do use twisting actions in Tango, not in Tai Chi, because in Tai Chi, the idea of any martial art is always to have your defense in front of you, and there's no situation where you're going to do this and have your body open to an attacker. There always has to be this sort of circling energy, even in single whip. My energy is still circular this way and not expanding this way. But in dance, there are times where we do twist, and we twist when we're getting or doing an impulse motion where we're trying to get a waltzing almost like feeling. We impulse or we move with a more flight to the body. And in those situations, I'm turning forward with a curve, then I add a twist, and it gets me a little bit of impulse that we use in dancing that we wouldn't use in Tai Chi, where we're trying to be grounded at all times. But what I have found over the last 10 years of analysis is there's no action that can not be defined by the 8 techniques. And then what I did for the walking code was apply this to all walking scenarios, whether walking on flat ground, walking uphill, downhill, walking upstairs, walking downstairs. It's all definable using the 8 energies of Tai Chi, which I call core techniques because the 8 energies in Tai Chi aren't defined, like I mentioned. What I did was define them in terms of what the core is doing, and I call those movements the core techniques. Each of the core techniques is correlated with one of the 8 energies of Tai Chi. I just give them names that are more relevant to walking or dancing than to a martial art, because in walking, in normal life, or dancing, we're not trying to strike people. So techniques like shoulder strike don't really sound good when we're trying to talk about walking or dancing technique, or elbow strike, because in Tai Chi, those energies are utilized for certain types of martial actions, but they're also utilized in a lot of transitions because we do a lot of walking in Tai Chi. And the names of the energies are usually applied to the actual final strike and not the transitions. In normal life, when we're dancing or walking, it's all about transitions and we're not striking. So what I did was change the names. Ward off in Tai Chi, I call pulse, because that's what we use when we're jumping off the ground. Pluck, I call reach, because we can be reaching with the arm, opposite from the extending hip. We can also be reaching forward with the leg. My right leg can be reaching or extending and reaching forward and down. That is the same energy as pluck. I'm extending my right hip, turning my upper torso towards that right hip, and rooting my right leg with the lower torso rotation. That is reach, or the same energy as pluck. Then we have shoulder strike in Tai Chi, which is this motion here. I'm extending my left hip, I'm turning my upper torso to the right and my lower torso to the right, causing a shoulder strike action. So my upper and lower torso are turning away from my extending hip. In the walking code, I call that reach back, because when I reach back or extend my right hip and turn my upper and lower torso away from it, my right leg reaches back. The opposite of what happens if I turn my upper torso towards the extending hip, I get a reach forward, which I just call reach. So reach back is going to be turning everything away from the extending hip, and reach or reach forward is turning the upper torso towards the extending hip. It's all generated by the rotational energy. In the other energy using hip extension, which is push, I keep the same name because we can push with our legs. I can push in kickboxing. A push would be that strike or that cross with my right hand, but I can also push just forward with the body. I can push my hips as I'm moving uphill. I can push myself. And so I didn't find any need to change the name of the energy of push. I kept them the same. So for our hip extension energies in the walking code, we have ward off or pulse, reach or pluck, reach back or shoulder strike, or push, which is push. Then we have 4 energies, which are the hip flexion energies. And we have in Tai Chi an energy called split, which has the upper torso turning towards a flexing hip and the lower torso turning away from the flexing hip. We also used split when we shifted forward. My upper torso is turning towards the flexing hip, lower torso away from the flexing hip, until we extended the flexing hip and created pluck. So that is split. We also use split in this action called crane cools its wings. And so you can see how you get the name of that energy as the arms separate in crane cools its wings. You can see how the arms separate using split in the movement of parting the wild horse's mane. So that's where that name comes from. It's a splitting energy. In regular motion, I use the term set because it is what I would use if I was going to talk about running and saying ready, set, go. And I'm going to be running and I'm ready and then set. I flex my right hip as I turn the upper torso forward, as I turn my upper torso towards that right hip. We have ready, set, and set gets me into this position, and go would be the pulse where I'm running. So that's where I got set from. Ready, set, go. Then one of the other movements in Tai Chi is elbow strike. Elbow strike is turning the upper and lower torso away from the flexing hip. In Tai Chi, there are no Tai Chi movements that are actually called elbow strike, as a matter of fact. But if you analyze it, and I'm going to do an elbow strike, what I'm actually doing is, at that final moment, flexing my right hip, turning my upper torso to the left and my lower torso to the left, and it causes a twisting action. It causes a twisting action as I have part of my body, the upper part of the body, turning in one direction, and the lower part of the body, the hip, pulling back in the other direction. So instead of pushing off the ground with the hip is really trying to rotate the whole body this way. That's flexing my right hip. And if I do that as I turn the whole upper torso to the opposite side, upper and lower torso to the opposite side, you get this winding action because one part of the body, the upper part's turning this way while it's being pulled in the other direction from the hip. So that's elbow strike. But what do we use elbow strike for in walking? And I call it sync in the walking code because it usually syncs the weight in some manner. We do this when we are transitioning all of our weight onto one leg. And so I'm going to flex my right hip, turn my upper and lower torso towards the left, and it's going to put all of my weight onto my left leg, and generally associated with flexion of my left knee, I call that sync, because I'm going to sink my weight all the way over to this side. Then we have 2 more flexion of the hip energies. One is called lift. Lift is the core energy. We have two more flexion of the hip energies, and one of them is lift. Lift is equivalent to the Tai Chi energy of press, which we have flexion of my rear hip and upper torso going away from the rear hip, lower torso going towards the rear hip. Press turns to push by changing the hip flexion to hip extension. And we use press or lift in walking because as I'm taking a step forward, lift is that action. I'm lifting the body forward as I flex my standing leg hip. It lifts the body up. So that energy there is the same as press, which is this energy here. I'm just using it from this position in a walking manner. And then the final energy in Tai Chi that correlates with the walking code is the rollback in Tai Chi, which is this energy here. Upper and lower torso turning towards my flexing hip. This is a very recessive or retreating energy in Tai Chi because it's all yin. Upper torso turning towards the flexing hip, lower torso turning towards the flexing hip. And what it causes the body to do is in Tai Chi, we call this rollback. And this is a defensive motion. It actually can create an arm bar or elbow bar. And in reality, what it's doing is causing the body to move away or retreat from the opponent, even though we always use some sort of offensive action in Tai Chi rather than just purely running away. So that's why I have a defensive motion of an arm bar, which is somewhat offensive, but the whole energy is moving away from the attacker. So in the walking code, I call this energy retreat because I would use this to walk backwards. I turn my upper and lower torso towards the flexing hip, and I walk backwards from the side view. As I turn my upper and lower torso towards the flexing hip, it causes me to retreat. Retreat is also used, depending on the previous setup that I used before it, to step to the side. In my example that I used earlier about the gentleman who was not able to step to the side, like this, I now know what that motion is. And it is elbow strike or sink, meaning turning my upper and lower torso away from my flexing left hip. And then I add or combine that with retreat, following that by flexing my right hip. And then now I have a side step. We use this in tango. When we start off with a side step, we begin with sink followed by retreat, then sink followed by set, and then we continue to walk. That's a side step in dancing. I combine sink, which is elbow strike, with retreat, which is rollback, and then sink to the other side, which is elbow strike, with set or split. And we can use those energies in dance just like we do in Tai Chi. And now if I were to try to describe that motion of taking the side step, I would know exactly what's going on. If you want to step to the side, turn both the upper and lower torso towards the right leg. Now you're balanced, and now what we're going to do is sink back or flex your right hip as you do that, and it's going to bring you to the side. Versus what the gentleman in the class was probably doing was going here and pushing, using extension of his right hip. He was probably coming here, settling the weight, and then pushing to the side. And there was no way he could stop himself because that motion, once you push, it ends there. There's no way to end that push in the middle. So in order to correct mistakes, you have to have some sort of understanding of what's going on. And if somebody can't visually see what you're doing and replicate it, it would help, I believe, to be able to explain it in a more concrete manner by explaining exactly what components or what quanta are going into the movement as a whole. And so that's why I call this the quantum movement system. What can the quantum movement system be applied to? I believe it can be applied to almost anything, particularly if we utilize not just the curving action that we use in Tai Chi, but we also add the twisting action that we use in dance. Then we have the 8 energies of Tai Chi, and then we multiply that by the twist. So we have pulse and twist pulse, we have reach and twist reach, we have reach back and twist reach back, and that's how I define those sort of things. If I'm just doing a dance, I can just be dancing side to side with somebody, and what I'm using is the system. I'm using sync followed by set by turning my upper torso, then sync followed by set, sync followed by set. Sync, set, sync, set. And then I can add a twist sync here. Instead of just turning the upper torso towards my right leg as I sync, I'm going to do twist sync, and I'm going to end up with a turn. So as my couple dancing at a wedding is doing, they can turn by using twist sync, set. And then just sync and set, sync and set, sync, set, sync, set, sync, set, sync, twist, set. And they can turn in any direction by understanding what they're doing. Twist, sync, twist, sync, twist, sync, twist, sync, twist, sync, regular sync. Regular sync, I go side to side. Twist sync turns me 90 degrees. So we can have a very precise definition of what energies are going into every motion if we have to explain it. A lot of times we don't have to explain it. A lot of times people just have an intuitive ability to repeat a movement that they see, particularly if it's a very simple movement. Most people could probably do this without a lot of explanation. But not everybody, and that's why some people are afraid to go out dancing, because they don't really know how to do it and how to move their body in that manner. By having this system, we can quantify what's going on in the core and be able to help people. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that everybody can follow this, but at least we have something beyond just, I'm going to do something, you're going to watch it and try to repeat it. And if you can't repeat it, then just watch it again and then try again and over again. That doesn't work for everybody. And that's why some people have 2 left feet. I believe having some more conscious ways of explaining something that are just beyond just body memory or intuitiveness or kinesthetic feeling is going to help some people, and that can also help people with problems with their walking, where a lot of issues come from incorrect use of the core. I've talked about people who pitch forward when they walk, which is very problematic, and it's because they're not rotating, meaning stepping forward by turning my upper torso on one side. What they do is turn both sides at the same time, causing them to pitch forward. So it's a misuse of the 8 techniques. And any problem people have with walking, or almost any other thing, we can find out what's wrong by understanding how the 8 techniques are used correctly, and then how they can be misused to create an incorrect or dysfunctional way of moving. So far, I haven't found any sort of things that cannot be explained by the 8 techniques or the core techniques, but I am not an expert in all types of movements, all athletics or anything like that. But I, so far, believing that all movements in Tai Chi, which includes all weapon forms, using the fan, using the sword. All these things can be explained using the Tai Chi Code or the quantum movement system, and the thousands of different movements in Argentine tango that can be explained very precisely using this sort of system. It makes me believe that it could be applied to almost anything you can think of, at least as far as those things require you being on 2 feet. Once you get on the ground and are not subject to gravity in the same way, then all bets are off, and I have no idea how that works. But I do believe thoroughly in my mind that staying on your feet vertical requires you to use neurologically some sort of well-established system, even if you don't know in your mind consciously what that system is. We're all using it. Otherwise, we couldn't just move around so randomly and not be able to fall over. We would accidentally plantar flex the foot too much or accidentally bend the knee too much, and we wouldn't be able to prevent ourselves from falling over. There is a neurologic connection between the 3 elements of the core and then what happens with our knee energy and our ankle energy that allows us to do all kinds of stuff without falling over. I can just move all kinds of random ways, and somehow I'm able to stay vertical without thinking at all about what's happening in my knees and my ankles. Even though, as I said before, if I were to just push my ankles back just slightly without counterbalancing, I would fall over immediately. Our neurologic system doesn't allow that to happen. So that is an explanation of the quantum movement system and its subsystems, which I call the codes. The Tai Chi Code, the walking code. I have a tango code, which I have not done videos on. If people are interested in that, they could, of course, let me know. And then I imagine it can be applied to all kinds of different things. I'm just not an expert in those other things to be able to apply each of the 8 techniques to all the different movements. I'm going to be playing some tennis, and I'm going to try to see if I can apply the 8 techniques to tennis. Just don't know how to do it yet. I've noticed that there are so many different movement systems out there, most of which I'm not even familiar with, and it's because some people are trying to figure out how to explain body movement because it is so complex. And everybody has a different rationale or explanation for how we're supposed to move. I don't believe that there's any movement system out there that is so specific as the quantum movement system and the subsystems being the Tai Chi Code and the walking code and its other codes. I don't think there's any other movement system out there that is able to explain full body movement in such a precise way, defining all of the different movements of your major elements of your body, being the chest rotation, waist rotation, and hip action, as well as the peripheral joint actions, the knees and the ankles, because each one of the core techniques is associated with a very specific action of the knee joints and the ankle joints. So every movement that we do can be predicted based on the type of energy that we're using from the 3 elements of the core, and there's only 8 different possible energies that we can use in order to stay upright and functional. So that's why I want people to try to listen and understand this system and see where it can be applied, because I believe it can have applications far beyond what I'm using it for, where walking and dancing and things like that. There are so many other things that it can probably be applied to. You just need to have an expert out there in those variations of movement, and they can figure out how to apply this system to it, because I believe it is kind of a universal system. And I'm hoping that more people catch on to this. I think it's very difficult to go out there and just promote this. It's hard for me, and I haven't done it, to walk into a Tai Chi school and tell a grandmaster, hey, I think I figured out Tai Chi, why don't you listen to me? And it kind of doesn't work that way. So I've been doing it this way, putting stuff out on the internet for free, trying to see if people can catch on. Thanks very much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I hope this explains to you what the quantum movement system is and how it can be used for all kinds of things, because I really do believe that if more people took this up, that it really could change the nature of movement.